Hello, my name is Chris Fisher, and I'm the Executive Director of the Portsmouth Institute for Faith and Culture, a Benedictine Center for the Catholic Intellectual and Contemplative Life. The Portsmouth Institute is an apostolate of Portsmouth Abbey in Rhode Island and St. Louis Abbey in Missouri. One of the activities of the Portsmouth Institute is to investigate and to promote a particularly Benedictine approach to education. We do that through publishing, intellectual retreats for teachers and students, and by offering encounters with liturgy and the divine office. Today, I'm delighted to add virtual conversations such as this to our roster of programming. Joining me today for a conversation about St. Benedict and Catholic education is André Gushurst-Moore. André is a graduate of English literature from Oxford University, and since 2003, he has taught in Benedictine schools, previously at Downside in Somerset, and presently at Worth in Sussex, where he is second master or vice principal or assistant headmaster in American parlance. For our viewers, Portsmouth Abbey and St. Louis Abbey are brother monasteries and schools to both Downside and Worth. The four abbeys all belong to the English Benedictine congregation. So André and I are kind of spiritual brothers in learning and education. André's writing has appeared in a number of periodicals in the UK and the US, including the Catholic Herald, the Chesterton Review, the University Bookman, the Political Science Reviewer, and St. Austin Review. And he is the author of two books, The Common Mind, Politics, Society, and Christian Humanism, from Thomas More to Russell Kirk, which was published by Angelico Press in 2013, and Glory in All Things, St. Benedict and Catholic Education Today, which was published by Angelico in January of this year. From 2000 to 2003, André lived in Freeburg, Maine, in a farmhouse built in 1828, when some of the founders of America were still alive and active. During that time, he was senior fellow of the Russell Kirk Center in Michigan, which is a wonderful organization. And he also, as a proper American of his time, grew a beard and chopped wood, thinking of Robert Frost. So for my American viewers here, he understands our soul. He married his wife, Bruna, a Denver, Colorado native in 1990, and they have three grown children, the youngest of whom, Josephine, was born in the Maine farmhouse. So André tells me she could technically become president of the United States, unlike her older siblings who were born in England. So welcome, André, to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's very good to be with you.
So what I hope to talk about today is inspired by your most recent book, which I have to say is just brilliant. It's so full of wisdom, but at the same time, it's profoundly accessible. Right? It's not filled with technical jargon, which also just seems so Benedictine to me, right? To not be inaccessible, but to be full of wisdom, but also for, you might say, the lay reader. I think it demonstrates not only your breadth of learning, but your experience as a teacher, your experience spending time with students, that you don't have an abstract notion of education, but the actual experience of being with kids. Like our headmaster at Portsmouth likes to say, of wasting time with students in the best way possible. That so often happens at boarding schools like ours. So thank you for this book of yours.
Thank you, Chris.
I want to start perhaps by trying to understand really what makes Benedictine education unique. What do we mean when we say Benedictine education? And so I want to start maybe with thinking, what is the distinction between, or is there any, between Catholic education in general and Benedictine education in particular?
I suppose I would start, and I tend to start in my own mind with some kind of definition in response to that question, with the 1500-year tradition. We can make a reasonable assumption that from the earliest times, groups of monks, certainly those who followed the rule of St. Benedict, that schools would have been pretty much coterminous with the monastic community, the monastery, the abbey itself. So rather, as I think it's natural for a Christian parent to teach their children, or indeed any parent, since it's essentially a human faculty, a human desire, a human predisposition to teach children, that monks would have done the same as a form of family themselves. And we can sort of discern at a certain time in that 1500-year period that there would have been schools for those who lived in the town or community external to the monastery but near to it. And then there would have been schools within the monastery itself to teach novices and so on. So I think that's the first thing, that we're, in Benedictine institutions, very aware of tapping into a very old tradition that goes back into the last years of the Roman Empire in the West. I think another aspect that always strikes me in relation to this question is flexibility. So unlike the forms of education, the pedagogy, practice of some of the later, particularly the Counter-Reformation orders, the Jesuits and then the teaching orders that followed them into the 19th century, the Benedictine education Benedictine form of Catholic education is, by contrast, less schematic than perhaps the Jesuit approach. And of course, this could be seen as a strength or a weakness, depending on your idea of what a good education is. Is it to pass on a canon of pre-existing central, the central stem of knowledge that we need to continue, or is it something something more adaptable to times and circumstances? And I think the enduring quality of Benedictine education is related to that flexibility and the instinct to respond to particular needs, human needs of people, communities, young people in any given particular time. So a Benedictine school in the 19th century would look very different from a Benedictine school in the 21st century, which would probably be pretty much entirely different from something from the 6th century. But nonetheless, there would be continuing. I think another thing is connected to this flexibility is a sort of personalism. It's difficult. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about our current period is delivering, as we say, sounds like posting a letter, but delivering an online curriculum from a Benedictine school, when you could say, well, the whole point of it is that personal relationship between the teacher and the pupil, that human relationship. But we're like monks down the centuries, quite good at responding to technological advances. And Worth was, way back in the 1990s, was very much at the cutting edge of IT in the classroom and so on. So our own particular information revolution, following on from the invention of printing and following on from the mass production of illuminated manuscripts, there's a certain continuity there, that monastic education has turned its hand very readily to whatever is good in the human world around it, for the greater glory of God.
That's so interesting, that you bring up the kind of personalism, that deep acknowledgement, like you talk about in your book, of the reality of human nature, right? And you call the monks and monasticism and monastic schools kind of humanists in their own way, right? That they take the reality of the human condition very seriously. Do you see that as informing their adaptability and their uniqueness as schools?
Yes, I think so. I think it's what I think of as the sacramentalism, and which in a certain way is the realism of monastic living. Is the recognition that where we are now is the only place we can be now. In some way, this is where we're called to be, and where we are now is full, if we could only see it, of the glory of God. And what this place that we are around us is revealing God in all sorts of ways. So that sense of that reality itself is a sacrament, is to be sacramentally experienced. It is, I think, profoundly Benedictine. I can remember one of our monastic brethren saying about some water. I heard somebody asking him, "Is it holy water?" And he responded, just like that, "All water is holy." And of course, it was, it was very wittily and cleverly said. There's something very Benedictine about that, but it was very apposite and very true. That, and something I explore in the book, something that fascinates me and links with some important Catholic writers of the 20th century, that the seven sacraments of the Church are not kind of free-floating invention of Catholic theology, but they sit on a whole understanding of the nature of reality. That everything is a sacrament. These are particular sacraments, but that's the sense in which all water is holy. And I think that one aspect of the materialism of 20th century and 21st century life is that in being absorbed in commodities, commercialism, the sense of everything around us being, including people, objects which can be bought and sold, is that we undervalue the material. The material world is in its own material nature wonderful, sacramental, God-given, and so the simplest material object, be it a piece of bread, a cup of wine, or a manuscript, a book, the vessels of the altar, the vessels of the table, everything that we use and experience in our daily round has the capacity to reveal God to us.
Before I came to Portsmouth, I had zero experience with the Benedictines at all. I had gone to Catholic education for university, but not Benedictine. And what you're talking about here became so evident to me that this was not an abstract concept, right, of the sacramentality of the material world, right? That in a Benedictine community, these things become so concrete and so real to their actual experience of life, right? And so, you could see how, strictly kind of theologically speaking, those could become abstract concepts, the sacramentality of the world, right? But when it's lived and when the vessels of the altar, right? Like Benedict says, are treated like the vessels of the table or of the farm, right? In the same sense, the students and our books and our classrooms themselves, well, it really does enliven the community with a certain sacramentality that is not abstract at all, right? That is very real, very lived.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's where the sacramentality of Benedictine life connects to that, the central virtue of humility, because they're both ways of responding to, in the truest sense, to reality, which for us in our earthly life is very much an earth, a grounded, literally grounded one. And it's that sort of groundedness in reality, which is, as you say, sacramental, that is distinctly Benedictine, I think. Yeah.
How does that affect what happens in the classroom, right? Because of course, a school is fundamentally a classroom, right? That's the most important work that we do. So how does that notion of sacramentality affect what we do in the classroom?
I think this is a question that is very is particularly pertinent at the moment. It's something that we, as a school, I think struggle with. I think it's a good struggle. I think it's it's a struggle which will lead us somewhere. But for us in this country, it is particularly a struggle because we have little final say over the content of our curriculum. So a Catholic school in the United States will be able to teach what it likes, assess in the way it does, and it can certify its education and its students entirely itself. But in this country, we work with the national syllabuses and specifications for the GCSE courses up to 16, or the A-level courses up to 18, or indeed the international baccalaureate, which many American schools use as well. These syllabuses, specifications, courses are certainly informed by a certain educational vision, but it is frequently one that does not include God. So it might include some good literature, some great literature, and bodies of mathematical and scientific knowledge, but the people who are putting this together do not necessarily have any sense that that somehow connects to a broader theological understanding of the world. So we feel ourselves a bit limited by that. So the question then is, well, how are we different from the school down the road, which is not a faith-based school, it's not a church school, but we're studying the same kinds of national syllabuses and specifications, working towards the same public examinations. And I think there are different ways of answering that question. And in the end, every Catholic school, I think, has to answer these questions itself. We have Catholic schools which are private. They have to charge fees. We also have Catholic schools which exist within the state-maintained sector. So they are publicly funded, but they have their own Catholic identity. So, the answer to the question, well, how are we distinctive, it is one for each school to answer, and the answers will be in different ways related to either, I think, method, the way we teach, or content, what we teach, and whether I'm not sure there's a kind of a right and wrong here. We might think that as a Catholic school we have a duty to pass on something of the nature of Christian civilization, and so we might be looking at particular historical periods in history. We might be looking at Catholic authors in English literature classes. We might, make reference to the considerable number of Catholic religious and priests who contributed to scientific knowledge and so on. But I think, one could take it to a very to quite an extreme, at which point you'd have to be entirely independent, I think, of any external influences, and then you would start to be teaching Catholic maths and Catholic physics and from my time in America, when I was homeschooling our eldest child for a while and using some materials from an outfit in California, and this is very possible in the homeschooling movement, that there is a way of teaching Catholic education as something which involves very different content from other forms of education. I think for us, we're never going to be in that sort of position. So what we have to think about, I think, is some kind of transfiguration of the things that we have to teach if we follow the only kinds of qualifications that our fee-paying parents will ever recognise. So we can't give out our own certificates based on our own syllabuses. So it will be a matter of method, pedagogy, the way of doing things, that personal touch, the personal interaction, the face-to-face, the individual attention. But what we might be looking at could be all sorts of things, which I think is something problematic, because we're often required to teach things, certain things in a certain way that we would not do if we could do whatever we liked. But so there's a need for that Benedictine adaptability, flexibility, but also the readiness to see God in all things, to see, okay, this is what I've got, these are the pupils I've got, this is the material I've got. All that can reveal God and Christ if I can do that. Now, I imagine like you, not all of our staff, our teachers, our faculty are Catholics, and not all of them are indeed Christians. But so I think the schools have to address that. How do we form our staff, whether they identify themselves as Catholic or not? How do we form them in a particular pedagogy, a particular way of doing things that is very much Christ-centered? And that's quite a significant challenge. It's by no means impossible, but I think it's something that emerges very naturally from the call to evangelization by recent popes, and particularly the new evangelization, the evangelization of all those things in our civilization that once were Christian but aren't any longer. And that of course means the people we work with as well.
Yeah. Your remarks about teaching things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise choose to teach as a Catholic and monastic school, but being required to either by governmental standards or whatever it might be. We do have a little bit more flexibility here in the States, like you say. We have a great humanities program, for instance, here, where we can basically create a kind of core curriculum inspired by the great books. But I wonder too if there's some sense that, I don't want to overburden the analogy, but there might be some sense in which dealing with what you have is also profoundly monastic in terms of the early monastic schools, right? And after Augustine, and then especially in the monasteries in the 7th and 8th centuries, kind of baptizing the classics, the pagans, right?
Yeah.
That's the literature they had, were the ancient Roman authors.
Yeah.
And they didn't say, well, some did say, but the monasteries didn't say, we're Christians, we're not going to read this, right? They said, this is part of our heritage. We're going to find in it the glory of God, like you say,
Yeah.
right? And if they can do that for the pagans, perhaps part of our unique kind of monastic education is, well, we can certainly do that with 21st century physics, I would think, right? We can do that with study of history.
Yeah.
We do that in our program here at the Abbey in reading Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, right? What's true in it. And that, in a way, might be kind of the best service we can do to the breadth of learning.
Yes, I think that's true. I think it's again, it's a monastic shibboleth that whatever is human, whatever discloses the human discloses the divine. We can only ever, and I suppose this is a very Christ-centered way of looking at it. We can only ever, in this present sublunary world, find the divine in the human. It doesn't exist outside the human. It exists in creation, which is why we need to see ourselves as part of that creation. But it's I think that's a very a very good way of looking at it, that the monks used whatever they had to hand. I was very struck when I the year before last went to Belmont Abbey in North Carolina, and the monks came there in the 19th century, and the church and the monastery is built from bricks that were made out of the clay that exists in that place. So they've literally built from the ground up with the ground. And when you look at the bricks, they do look homemade, and they have raised an abbey church, a beautiful abbey church, and the monastery in this way. And I thought that again, either a metaphor or a sacrament of the nature of Benedictine monastic life. So yes, whatever, I might not choose to teach Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale, but it's one of the books that I've got to choose from. I can teach it to some extent on its own terms within the ideology that produced it, which is how it might well be taught in a class in a different school with a different ethos and framework. But I can also teach Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale within the tradition of utopian and dystopian writing that goes back to Thomas More and includes Christian writers like Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels, and the critique of, and actually, Atwood's understanding of Christian theocratic tendencies in the evangelical right of the late 1990s makes for an interesting religious discussion. What is she being fair? If not, why not? How does this relate to Galileo, or and then you can start to sort of challenge the perceptions that the church has always limited intellectual activity. And so it's possible to draw out things that relate to a broader evangelical purpose in the nature of a school like this, from materials that come from a very different standpoint than ours.
Yeah. I was reading an essay recently by Walker Percy that he had published in the 80s in New Criterion on Moby Dick, right? And trying to understand Melville and his own struggles with Christianity and his desire to be Christian in some way, but also his kind of rejection of Christianity, especially the Calvinism in which he was raised. And that strikes me as extremely important for a monastic school, say, to encounter, right? To encounter the deeply human experience that Melville draws us into, and really the kind of human pilgrimage in a way, right? That we see there, and with your example of Handmaid's Tale, there's opportunity there to think about it, say in relation to Hawthorne, right? The Scarlet Letter, to these traditions in our own American society, where we have, frankly, had some of the difficulties that Atwood's describing, right? And of course, not existent in your own country's history.
And I think that engagement with the non-Christian or the formerly Christian is very much part of what places like these have to do now. It's very different from the world of Catholic education, at least in England, up to the 1960s, say, where we tend to talk in this country of the old kind of fortress Catholicism. Sometimes the fortress was almost literally built because the institutions looked like sort of neo-Gothic fortresses, but it was very much schools were primarily centres, I think, of catechesis, a way of preparing the young for the sacraments. By definition, all of the pupils in the school would be Catholics. Probably they'd only be boys, and the girls would be in a different school. There'll be a number of monks, nuns, brothers teaching, and there's a kind of tribalism about that. So you grow up only knowing Catholics, and you stay within your own almost a ghetto, really, particularly in England, where Catholics were very much seen as outside the establishment. We live in a very different world now, and whether we like it or not, it seems that what reality is calling us to is to find ways of being a Catholic and a Catholic educator and a Catholic student in a place where there are people from all sorts of backgrounds, but the thing they have in common is that they want to be in that place. And we find in this country that Catholic education is very desirable to non-Catholics, including Muslims, because they know that school is God-centered. So something we find there then that we have something profoundly in common with Muslims, and that it is possible to experience that and live that out within an education and a place that is still authentically Catholic. So that's our challenge. How are we authentically Catholic whilst being fully open, like the courtyard of the Gentiles that Pope Benedict spoke about, completely open, but still maintaining that heart of orthodoxy, integrity, whatever you call it, that happens in the temple that's right by the courtyard. So that's a challenge, and that may be a challenge that's rather nearer to St. Benedict's time than 100 years ago. You know, we're in similar territory. I think Rod Dreher's book on the Benedict option, which is very much the kind of the starting point for my book, was a tremendous tremendously energetic shot in the arm to debate on these things, and whether one agrees entirely with Dreher's analysis or not, the value of St. Benedict for our times seems to be quite evident.
You make a distinction in your book between scientia and sapientia, right? There's two different modes of learning. Scientia may be science, analytical knowledge, intellectual knowledge. Sapientia, wisdom, you know, is often translated as, and I think you do it quite beautifully, as mystical contemplation, I think. And you say that one thing a monastic school might do is recover some sense of sapientia, right? This mystical contemplation, as opposed to, or maybe in addition to, scientia. It strikes me that that's a radical kind of sentiment, right? Because we're so used to thinking in terms of analytical knowledge, and even as Catholic schools, we've adopted this mode of speaking about ourselves, right? That we engage in critical thinking and analysis and scientific mode of learning across the disciplines. But you're saying maybe we need to recover something older, something maybe even pre-modern in that sense. I wonder if you can draw the distinction out a little more for us, and maybe say why you believe that sapientia, this mystical contemplation, is well suited to our times.
Yes, it's. I've been quite broad brush with my use of these terms, but I think there's something useful in that. I would associate the word sapientia with the wisdom that involves very much with what St. Benedict is talking about in his rule. And you know, something I noticed in reading the rule of St. Benedict in Latin once, which is not something that everybody does or has done, but as I said to somebody who looked at me rather quizzically when I said that, well, you know, I don't get out very much. So, I did sit down and go through it with my rusty Latin, but one thing that particularly struck me was how often the word cor for heart appears, and on its own and in compounds, and how infrequently the word anima, or even mens for, you know, mind. So instead of something around, you know, sort of in the head, if you like, mind or the soul as something distinct from the body, Benedict is talking all the time about the heart, and this is I think something connected with sapientia and scientia. The wisdom that is for Benedict humility, I think, is something that is very much based in the heart, and also in the earth. So my sense is that on the whole, Benedict is more Aristotelian than Platonic. Again, being very broad brush. Scientia, at least as I understand it, is to be related to that movement from scholasticism into the Enlightenment, and then ultimately into the postmodern unraveling of that idea of the the power and authority of pure reason. Now, where does this sit within the Benedictines? I mean, it's very interesting to me that the father of scholasticism was a Benedictine, St. Anselm, and the strength, the value, the power of his understanding of what reason can do is still evident in his ontological argument, which still puzzles and intrigues philosophers and theologians today. I distinguish in the book between Anselm's Credo ut Intelligam with St. Bernard's Credo ut Experiar. And it seems to me that Bernard is very much in the sapiential tradition of monastic learning and wisdom. And Anselm is only beginning, a trend that just goes in all sorts of directions that he wouldn't have anticipated. And whether we like it or not, we live with the effects of postmodernism, whether we think of ourselves in late modernity or postmodern or post-human or transhuman or what. But what we are undoubtedly in is in a society which has come to distrust reason. So we can't go back there. We can't kind of ravel up again the integrity of reason when it's been so fully, pulled apart, and the postmodern abyss is there. And there are ways, I think, of engaging with that, but that's best left to theologians much more adept at what they're doing than I am. So to me, it seems that St. Benedict, who comes from somewhere completely different from all of that, still has something to say to us about the ways of the heart rather than the ways of the head, some of which, of course, very powerful. The other thing I would say is that I think whether we adopt a sapiential or a sciential approach to learning also determines and reflects our attitude to the object of study. And we think of the sciential as being very analytic, and we talk about interrogating things, and that always reminds me of Wordsworth's phrase, "We murder to dissect." And if we want to understand a bird, we can pin it down, kill it, and then tear it to pieces. There are other ways of understanding a bird. And I think, to me, the sciential approach can often lead to an arid skepticism. In other words, what we end up teaching our pupils is that you can pull anything apart and find there's nothing in it. And that seems to be a terrible disservice to them. What we should be doing, and I often think of, a lesson or a classroom as I tend to think of a stained glass window, and, a lesson should be a window onto God somehow, at some level. Sometimes it could be, a life-changing lesson. I think all of us who have gone along an academic direction would be able to point to certain lessons that classes, lectures, whatever, that have, are important points on a journey where we've got to, life-changing lessons. But we don't reveal the glory of God by deconstruction, and that's where whether we think of ourselves as postmodern or not, we're in a society that is always deconstructing everything and finding that there's nothing there, and that seems to be, rather than doing the work of God, I think it's probably doing the work of some other fellow who we don't really want to be linked too closely to. So that's my problem with the sciential, and I also have the problem with people who talk in phrases like "we now know that," because you can be sure that in a few months they'll be saying something different. So the provisionality of knowledge is often something that is overridden. You know, we have politicians in this country saying we're being led by the science. this sort of disembodied ultimate authority, kind of, you know, Platonic reason out there in the sky. So the kind of the sky knowledge of science, as opposed to the earth knowledge of the heart in Sapientia, that's the way I think of these things, and it seems that there is so much evidence in the 20th century and beyond about how science and technology have made us less than human, and there are ways in which attending to the ear of the heart, as Benedict puts it, that's the way we can be perhaps recovering the human in our society at this point in its history.
Yeah, I think especially in humanities disciplines, that kind of skepticism you talk about, right? There's two ways you can ask the same question. You can say, "Is that true?" right? Or you can say, "Is that true?" right? You can say it with this kind of this detached skepticism, kind of doubting it first and foremost, or you can say it lovingly, right, of the heart, right? That wow, you know, an admiration towards the thing, right? To want to know its truth. And there's a risk, I think, especially you know, in the kind of scientific mode of even doing the humanities, of overemphasizing the skeptical "is it true," as opposed to the admiration "is it true" question.
Yes, and I think there's something similar in Coleridge, who you know, if we see him in the context of Romanticism and as a reaction against Enlightenment rationalism, his attitude to what he found around him wasn't to ask the question, "Is it true?" but to ask the question, "How is it true?" Particularly in Christianity. Yeah.
I wonder how we might consider Lectio Divina as informative here in some way. You talk quite a bit about Lectio Divina in your book. I wonder if you can maybe just say, you know, what is Lectio Divina, and how is it important for schools, especially Catholic schools, to consider Lectio Divina as part of the life of the institution?
Yes, I think the first thing is to say is that Lectio Divina for us today is probably quite different from Lectio Divina as it was understood in the early monasteries and onwards. But I think there is still a continuity between what we do and what the old monks did in those times. I suppose a literal definition would be, or translation would be, prayerful reading, and it would be the prayerful reading particularly of sacred texts, scripture, and it's important, I think, to see it as a form of prayer. So it's not reading in the way that we think of reading, which is to take in information, perhaps knowledge, to study the language, that kind of thing. Lectio Divina is a form of prayer, and in that sense it is distinct and you know, sui generis as a kind of reading. And that I think it has enormous value in all sorts of ways in our schools and our communities today. It is a way of direct apprehension of what God is saying to us. And again, I think it fits into what we were saying about the sacramentalism and realism of Benedictine life. It is that sort of unmediated contact with the word in Scripture. I think the way it's done in community and in groups of people nowadays is again probably quite different from where it started in the monasteries, where it would be very personal. But again, it's a way of building community and experiencing Scripture as a community, and it can be a way of creating, as in the Mankewe movements model, a particular kind of spiritual friendship amongst young people and adults. So it's tremendously powerful in the formation of character, and has I think a very considerable power to transform people's lives. So its value, I think, is primarily there, its spiritual value. But it's occurred to me that it could also be seen as a way of understanding other things that we do in a school as well, in the classroom particularly, in that there is this experience of reading prayerfully, reading it with an openness to the divine. That could be applied to humane letters as well as divine letters. So that kind of the sense of the inherent sacredness of all created things means that there's no reason, it seems to me, that we can't apply that kind of prayerful attentiveness that we experience in Lectio to other forms of attentiveness, whether it's to reading a novel or poetry or attending to some aspects of the created world in science, or even looking at the profound mystical beauty of mathematics. That's the only thing about mathematics I understand, by the way, but I can understand, admittedly rather secondhand, that mathematics can be beautiful, and that probably it's a way of looking into the code in which the universe is written. I get all that. So, how do we experience that? I suppose what Lectio brings to different ways of doing it is a certain kind of reverence to what we're looking at, what we're examining, what we are in the presence of, whether that's a work of art, a work of literature, music, whatever it is, because we know that this is something that can reveal the sacred, then we have to adopt a disposition to experience the sacred, and that's something that we can learn in Lectio Divina, I think.
Yeah, I've been struck here. We too have a group of Mankewe missionaries from Chile who come to Portsmouth Abbey to develop Lectio Divina groups among the students. And I've got involved on the faculty side with our own groups, but also helping to mentor the students. And then also as a humanities teacher, it really struck me that there's so much overlap between the work we're trying to do, right? And I think you're absolutely right. It's the disposition that Lectio Divina encourages, which is really the disposition of the student in an important way, right? To listen to the teacher, right, as Augustine would call him, to listen to Christ.
Yeah.
The last question I want to ask, and then we can wrap up. I know I'm taking a lot of your time here, and I appreciate you being gracious with it. Is on the question of boarding schools in particular. We've been talking mostly about Catholic education and Benedictine education at large, which is useful, I think, for any Catholic school. But you and I both inhabit a very kind of particular subworld of Catholic education, which is boarding school Catholic education. And it strikes me, I think, especially in the American context, that most Catholic schools are not boarding schools, and there's not a rich tradition outside of especially the Northeast of boarding schools. There's much more of that tradition, obviously, in England, where we inherited from in New England. But I wonder if we could talk a bit, just as we close out here, why should Catholics in both of our countries, or why might Catholics consider boarding school as an option for them?
Yes, it's very something that Chesterton said once is that families and monasteries are in some ways in tension, and they're not the same sort of thing at all. And in some ways, monasteries exist to break down some of the negative aspects of tribalism and what familia meant in Roman society, and the tendency that there has been in older societies, more archaic societies, that everything is about family. Families then become inward-looking, and I think what the monastery does is to break down, particularly some of those negative tribal aspects of families and so on, and reorder reorder things, human lives, oriented towards grace and a higher kind of purpose. So that's the first thing, I think, is that if we remain in our families, then the danger is that we become closed to other people. There's something strange there, of course. I think there always has been something strange in Catholic families adopting the English public school model of sending your children away as soon as you can reasonably do so, and leaving their care to others, and that doesn't sit very easily with the duties of Catholic parents towards their children. So there are different ways of looking at it. I would say that nowadays the boarding school is rather different than what it used to be. So schools in this country are not, they don't have that deliberate Spartan quality that they once did, where you bring up your children by making things as hard as possible for them to do so, particularly to be happy. That's all gone, and we live in a world, I think, where boarding schools work very much with families. They're much more open to families, and the distinction between boarding and home life becomes much more elided. We have things like flexi boarding in this country, so day pupils can stay for 2 or 3 nights, and there are weekly boarders, so they always see their parents at the weekend, and then we have pupils who spend much more time here, and perhaps in this country, than they do with their family at home. Now, I think in a world of uncertainty, the boarding school, the Catholic boarding school, the boarding school attached to a Benedictine community, can bring those Benedictine virtues of stability and hospitality to young people who perhaps would otherwise not experience them. So that's the first thing. I think it's the idea of the monastery as some kind of hospital, which connects, I think, to Pope Francis's idea of the church as a field hospital. People's lives are not perfect, and their particular circumstances are not perfect. And if you acknowledge that, then what you can give to people in a community like this, a residential school, is something that they would not otherwise have got, have found. So that's simply a pragmatic response to the fact that we live in a fallen world, and there are things such as broken families, there are broken societies, and that there are ways of there are ways of giving stability to young people's lives in a boarding school that they might not get otherwise. So rather than thinking of the boarding school as something that is inimical or antipathetic to the family, we think of ourselves, I think, as a place where we can reinforce and supplement the work of families. I think that's very important, because it seems to me that in the West nowadays, the family is in very much sort of under siege, really. That it's difficult even for the most responsible, careful parents nowadays to spend the kind of time with their children that would have been expected as the norm at one time. Chances are both parents have demanding work outside the home, and that is simply an economic reality for them. They might like to have one parent staying at home to look after the children, but the economic realities of in our country simply don't allow that anymore. So we can there are certain things we can do in this world, this imperfect world, in boarding schools that I think are very valuable. Unfortunately, it's only open to those who can pay for it, and I think there are ways in which we should be looking to address that. And the Mankewe schools have a way of transferring, the income going into one school then helps to fund another school, and that seems to be a very fruitful arrangement.
Sure. Yeah. Again, you mentioned Benedict being Aristotelian before. It strikes me there's something very Aristotelian about what you say there too, right? That the city for Aristotle is really the one necessary political, social entity, right? That the family, in some sense, serves the city, right? It strikes me there's some similarity there. And of course, at the heart of the polis is the ecclesia, right? The church. Yeah. And something you wrote in your book, which I found so obvious, but I had never thought of, is that at monastic boarding schools like ours is the one place where the entire church lives together, right? In the same place. Yeah. Clergy, religious, lay people, lay adults, lay children, right? Including not only the students, but our own children, right? And we have the whole breadth of the experience of the church in one location, which seems utterly unique to us.
Yes, and I think it's a way of making a community real and healthy and strong, and it then becomes something that can be of service to the locality in all sorts of ways. So it's a way of, it's a centre in which there's an exchange of gifts, people who come in. I think, again, that's very Benedictine. There's a sense in which any guest who comes into the monastery is to be treated as Christ, partly because he may be bearing a message from Christ. so he may be some kind of angel who is saying something to that community that the community would not be able to hear otherwise. So that the interconnection between the community and other people outside it is and you know, we all have, you with your institute and so on, we have all sorts of ways of reaching out to the people. And I think that, again, that is very Benedictine. The idea that Benedict retreated with his community behind a wall which had no connection with the outside world seems to me the entirely the reverse of the truth. You know, we see in Gregory's dialogues, you know, Benedict meeting all sorts of people and having an effect on them. And by establishing communities and schools in this way, it becomes a place that can touch not only the lives within the community but those outside. But it wouldn't reach those people outside if it didn't exist itself. So it becomes then a centre of energy and focus that can enrich the world around it. And again, I think that's very much something that we're being called to do at this point, certainly within the context of the new evangelization.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Andre. Thank you for the conversation. And for everyone watching this at home, I encourage you to buy the book that Andre has written here, Glory in All Things, St. Benedict and Catholic Education Today. And thank you so much again.
Pleasure. Thank you, Chris.